Welcome to Ffrf's Ask an Atheist. I'm Patrick Elliott, Senior Counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at Ffrf in Washington, D.C.
And before we get to our guest for today, we did want to talk about some good news coming out of Alabama, which relates to personalized license plates, an issue that our members and a lot of people report to us and care about. We had a person report to us that this license plate was censored and rejected by the state of Alabama, Satan, and the person received a letter saying it was offensive under the state laws. And so our organization, one of our attorneys, wrote to the state and explained, really how people have a free speech right to select a message like this, a blasphemous message, an atheist message. And just recently, our person in Alabama reported that they actually got the license plate after it had been rejected. The state had changed its tune and allowed this to be on the roads. And that's likely because we had been working on issues like this in the past. We sued in Kentucky and won a case over somebody who wanted an I'm God license plate. And so just a fun, I guess, and recent development of some of the issues that FFRF is working on. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We have a guest. Mark, if you want to explain who our guest is and kind of what we're going to be discussing.
You bet. I love when we do stuff like that. So great work on the license plates, and it's just always something fun we do here at FFRF. So on today's show, we have Ben Needham, Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Political Affairs Department at the Human Rights Campaign, or HRC. We'll talk with Ben about the Equality Act, how it is going to advance in this Congress, what it was like growing up gay and black in Mississippi, and how those experiences helped to shape his worldview to fight for civil rights. Ben has over 20 years of experience leading campaigns for social justice with the LGBTQ and labor rights movements. Ben has a unique perspective that comes from growing up in an extremely religious household that taught him strong social values, but he also saw how organized religion can be corrosive. Ben can be found on Twitter at Needham B.
If you have questions, welcome, Ben. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I just wanted to point out for others, at the end, as always, if you have questions, leave your comments on the Facebook post, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. As always, FFRF is a 501c3 organization, so we're nonpartisan when it comes to elections, and things said by guests on this show are not necessarily reflective of the positions of FFRF. But welcome, Ben. We hope to have some questions for you. But prior to that, I think we have some of our own questions. And one of those, both of you I know are working in D.C. and often work on legislative issues. And so the Equality Act is kind of an important piece of legislation that our organizations have been working on. So, Mark, maybe you want to introduce that and that we can ask Ben about the Equality Act.
Sounds good. Well, the Equality Act, which guarantees equal protection for LGBTQ Americans, passed the House last week and is advancing in the Senate. Yet, at present time, the bill needs 60 votes to pass the Senate because of the filibuster. Ben, what will it take to get to 60 votes?
Mark, thank you for that question. If I could just start by giving just a 30-second sort of overview of the Equality Act so people understand. The Equality Act is a federal bill that will add LGBTQ protections to existing civil rights laws and strengthen protections for all people, including women, people of faith, and people of color. It would be a true sea change for equality in this nation if it is passed. Right now, LGBTQ people do not have explicit, comprehensive civil rights protections at the federal level. And as a result, millions of LGBTQ people and families depend upon states in which that they live in. And those rights change from state to state. And so that is the reason why, that is a little bit of the Equality Act, why we are pushing for it. And how do we get the 60 votes in the Senate? It's going to take a massive grassroots campaign targeting both Democrats and Republicans to get to that 60 number. Right now, we know if the bill was brought up for a vote, we would win on a simple majority. But Senate rules require that we get to 60 votes to keep moving this bill forward. And we have a few targets that we're positive about, that we think we have some great opportunities to pick up. And we are working extremely hard to sort of have a grass tops campaign to get those people to get to the 60 votes that we need. I think it's also helpful that we have a White House that is committed to this issue. The Biden-Harris administration is very supportive of the Equality Act, and they will also be pushing to help us get to that 60 number.
And so I just have a question about some of the areas where this would impact people's lives. Is it public accommodations and housing, or where are the areas that would be most impactful if this is passed?
Yeah, I mean, it would give people protections from discrimination in housing, healthcare, credit, and pretty much how people go about their daily lives. Jury service is in here. You know, one of the examples that one of our legal experts talk about is that women are charged a different price for the same shirt that I have right now because it's buttoned on a different side. And so there's that right there is a form of discrimination. And if we have any people of color like myself out there watching this video, it can be difficult sometimes to get a taxi in any major city. And that the Civil Rights, the Equality Act would also provide those protections. But as it relates to LGBTQ people, it would give protections, housing, healthcare, credit, jury service, and a slew of public accommodations.
Thank you.
Right. And so turning back to the 60 votes, in your opinion, should the filibuster be eliminated?
You know, in my personal opinion, I go back and forth on this. I'm a student of political science, and I love history, and I fully understand why the filibuster is there. As a strategist and as a good progressive, I just want to win. Look, I think we have to work in the parameters of where we are in the Senate right now, and that is to try to get to 60 votes. And I think if we get to a point of not being able to move things forward in the Senate, then we all need to take a step back and look and see how do we make the Senate more functional. We probably need to visit the filibuster at that point. I guess the short answer is I'm not willing to give up on the filibuster yet, but we should definitely keep an eye on it and figure out how having the filibuster there interferes with moving policy forward.
And what are some of the most effective ways FFRF members can support the passage of the Equality Act?
Yeah, so one, I would say go to www.hrc.org. We have a whole Equality Act section on there. You can sign up to be a community co-sponsor of the bill. And once you do that, we will get into our grassroots mechanism. Right now, we have calls going into the Senate, telling the Senate to bring forward the Equality Act, pass it, and put it on the desk of President Biden for signature. We ask people to write letters. We ask people to engage in their communities. And hopefully soon we're going to be doing a little bit of video testimony of people sort of telling their stories about being LGBTQ, the discrimination that they have faced, and how the Equality Act will help them live a fuller life that is free of discrimination. And so www.hrc.org, go there, sign up to become a community co-sponsor, and then there's a slew of grassroots activities from writing letters, making phone calls, engaging your members, setting up visits with your members in district, and we can give you all talking points and help and coach you through those things. But those are the ways that we're going to get the Equality Act through the Senate.
Great. And also FFRF members can participate through FFRF's own resources as well, in addition to HRC's, as well as with our action alerts, calling opportunities, and congressional meeting opportunities as well. And we're thrilled if folks can also work with HRC as well. And this week, we heard from Christian nationalist members of Congress who claim the Equality Act, if the Equality Act passes, God will detest anyone who doesn't submit and conform to traditional gender roles. Let's listen to Representative Greg Steube from Florida on the House floor during the debate on the Equality Act.
Deuteronomy 22:5 states, "A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this." Now, this verse isn't concerned about clothing styles, but with people determining their own sexual identities. It's not clothing or personal style that offends God, but rather the use of one's appearance to act out or take on a sexual identity different from the one biologically assigned by God at birth.
Ben, how do you respond to that?
It breaks my heart a little bit that is the language that is being used on the People's House, on the floor of the People's House. Look, I think we have to respond to that in the language that he's speaking to. And I know that, this is Ask an Atheist, but, core principles of his faith is love your neighbor. And we have to respond with that and highlight who his neighbors are. I think he is misinformed that his neighbors are probably white males like himself, and that his neighbors are people that look like me. His neighbors are people that are in same-sex loving relationships. And so I think we have to respond in a way that he understands, and not try to criticize him for where he's at in life, but meet him there and try to elevate him to where we need him to be.
And let's imagine we're in the near future. The Equality Act has passed. The Do No Harm Act has passed. And what do the secular and LGBTQ rights movements need to do to secure that future?
I think that we have to have a robust public education campaign around both the Do No Harm Act as well as the Equality Act. And that means sitting down with our legislators and having that conversation, and not just on the federal level. Change happens sometimes from the ground up or from the top down. And I think that at HRC, we like to make sure change is happening in both directions. And so talking with your local elected officials, asking them to get engaged around those issues. Talking with your federal elected officials, asking them to get engaged with those issues. And then talking with your neighbors and your family members and asking them to get engaged with those issues. That is how we're going to win this fight. Within the LGBTQ movement, we have seen tremendous progress around LGBTQ acceptance because more people have come out, more people are living their truth. And because of that, we see that support for LGBTQ Americans are through the roof right now. And that is how we're going to win this fight around the Equality Act and the Do No Harm Act. We have to live our lives out and proud, and we have to be educating people about the issues that are important to us, and we have to be bringing them along the way with us.
I just wanted to follow up on maybe engaging with people who disagree with us, which is something that obviously happens all the time with legislation. With the Equality Act, one of the reasons, as we kind of saw, is it may conflict with somebody's religious beliefs. And you've kind of given an example of maybe using language or kind of shared values that person might have. Are there other things that people can do? I mean, maybe in the sense of getting the person not to necessarily come to your position, but so that they're not standing as a vote in opposition or that they're not giving those types of speeches. So I'm curious kind of what you might suggest for our members or for other people. How do you deal with this religious objection to a bill like this or to other laws like this?
Yeah, I would first start by saying, one of the things I tell my colleagues and our members and supporters is start with the low-hanging fruit first. And that is, start with the people that are gettable. There are tons of people out here that just need to be properly educated about who LGBTQ people are and how we go about living our lives. That is very much the same as everybody else. We care about the same issues as everybody else. I would start there. And once you start to bring those people along, the middle, it's kind of what I would say, you're going to start bringing along the extremists, and that is with any issue out there, whether you're extreme on one end of the spectrum or not. I think that is what happened with the civil rights movement. I think that is what happened around marriage. These people are not, they were saying the same things around marriage. We just kept at it. We just kept talking about our rights as LGBTQ people to marry the people that we love. And we eventually either wore them down and they moved on to other issues like they have now, or they came around to us. And so we're going to have to start with the middle that's gettable. And the more and more that we get, I think the quieter that group becomes. And we have to be expanding that middle as much as possible. I think that there's always going to be 10 to 20% of the people that you're never going to convince to change their language or change the way that they are operating with us. And I don't think we should be banging our heads against a wall, trying to get them to be different than who they are. Like, that is a cultural shift that is just really hard to do. And a great example of this is, I grew up in Mississippi, and my whole life of being in that state, there was a Confederate flag flying in that state, or at least the bars of the Confederate flag in our state flag. And we just kept chipping away at it, and last fall, Mississippi replaced that flag that had the Confederate bars in it. It took time to get there. There are still people in the state of Mississippi that want that old flag. When I go home after the pandemic, I will still see that flag flying in yards and on cars and things like that. And those people are just not gettable. And we're going to have the same thing within the LGBTQ movement, or any progressive movement for that matter.
Just in relation to the flag, I think we just saw some images of the old flag and the new flag. And, from our members' perspective, one of the troubling things with the adoption of the new flag is the law that did it said two things. It couldn't have the Confederate flag as a part of it, but it mandated that the design had to have "In God We Trust." And so there was still this idea of exclusion within the law within Mississippi. So we have the image of the new flag. So I don't know if you have any opinions on kind of that idea that had to be mandated a part of the flag.
Yeah, while I am a Washingtonian these days, I still consider myself a Mississippian and a very proud Mississippian. And I knew that this bill was moving, and I hadn't really followed it very closely. I was a little jaded and thinking, this is going to be an uphill climb to get this flag changed. And so I didn't pay attention to the language that was there. And all of a sudden, I started to see all the designs. And I'm like, why in the world is "In God We Trust" in all these designs? And so I called a friend there, and he said, well, they actually put it in the law. And I thought, this is typical Mississippi. On the cusp of doing something great and doing something that is inclusive of everyone. And yet they find a way to be exclusive and exclude some people. And it's disappointing. I will say that the flag is a step in the right direction. We still have work to do, and we should not let up on making sure that we have a flag that represents all Mississippians, those that are people of faith and those that are not.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and turning to the Equality Act, we did get a question from one of our members, Robert, who said, I thought the Supreme Court already ruled that LGBTQ people are covered by the Civil Rights Act. So the Equality Act doesn't do anything that the Civil Rights Act already does. Is that true?
So the Civil Rights Act excludes LGBTQ people. And that is the reason why we are amending the existing Civil Rights Act to add LGBTQ people to the current Civil Rights Act. And so, no, the Supreme Court did not rule that LGBTQ people are included in the Civil Rights Act.
But with the Bostock decision, it did say LGBTQ people are protected from employment division. So I think where our support might be going is that if Bostock ruled, then is the Equality Act needed?
The Equality Act is absolutely needed. Bostock is a very limited ruling. It is exclusively around employment. And so that means that LGBTQ people can be discriminated in a whole host of other issues, again, like housing, like credit, jury service. And so there's a need to make sure that we have uniform law that is inclusive of LGBTQ people and protecting us from discrimination like we are doing other groups in the country.
And just one of the concerns, as an attorney, one of the concerns that I would have with that ruling is a different Supreme Court can obviously change its determination as to whether sex discrimination includes gender identity and sexual orientation, which thankfully that is the decision we came out with. But that's a judicial opinion that could get carved into or overturned. And so changing the law has value both in signaling to people, what are our values, what's allowed, but then also it can't be easily undone by a court that might decide in just a few years to undo it. So I think, Mark, to our question asker, I think that there's very good reasons to get the right legislation in place that can't be easily undone by by a judicially activist court that we may not know how they'll rule on it.
The attorneys at HRC would, I can hear them in my ear now saying exactly those things. Like, it's a court ruling. It can be changed. And while it sets precedent at the courts, we know that new precedent can be set. And so we need this law on the books. And let me rephrase that. We need to add LGBTQ people to the existing law that is on the books so that we're extending protections to the LGBTQ people under the current Civil Rights Act. The other thing I would say is that LGBTQ people can be discriminated in healthcare, which is extremely important that we sort of work to get the Equality Act passed so that we don't have that discrimination for LGBTQ people in healthcare. And I want to highlight the T portion of that, which is our trans community. There are people out there that would wish to deny medical services to our transgender family members, and we have a responsibility to make sure that they are not discriminated against in healthcare as well.
Great. And if you have questions for Ben Needham from the Human Rights Campaign, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Let's talk for a moment about your upbringing in Laurel, Mississippi, a majority Black community of roughly 18,000 people. You've talked about growing up in a very religious household and went regularly to an African Methodist Episcopal church and a missionary Baptist church. How did those experiences shape who you are?
Yeah, as someone who probably goes back and forth on my belief system and how I believe and if I believe, that I'm constantly challenging myself, I still have very fond memories of growing up in the church. My mother's side of the family was AME, and my dad's side of the family was Missionary Baptist. And I guess, quite frankly, I'm still a Baptist on the church roll back in Mississippi. I learned a lot of great things around about how to love your neighbor in that church. I also learned some bad things about how to love your neighbor in those churches. They were not always open-minded to people that didn't believe the way we believed. They were not always, quite frankly, accepting of other people of faith if their faith was drastically different from ours. In the South, we're still fighting this fight over, Christianity and the Baptists and the Catholics a little bit. And so all of those things were reinforced. And so I would say I learned some great things, but I also learned some things that just did not sit right with me and made me challenge myself to understand my place in this world, what I had to contribute to this world, and how whatever faith I have, and whatever that is, guides me into that service of others.
So was there someone in your growing up when you were younger who really impacted that tradition, or who helped weigh you through that religion and then sort of the idea of wanting to change things about the religious landscape where you grew up?
Yeah, my grandmother, Annie Mae Porter, is a big influence in my life, and I talk about her all the time. She lived to be 101, died a few years ago, and my grandmother was a woman of deep, deep faith. She grew up through the Depression era. She grew through the Civil Rights Movement. She grew through the 80s and the 90s and lived until, 2018. And she just had a great impact on my life around shaping what I believed. And her belief system was deeply rooted in faith. And what I did is I took from her belief systems and I kind of made them my belief systems in a way of not necessarily believing that they were based in faith or not, but based in how you treat one another. My grandmother was the woman that if someone in the community was hungry, they were fed. If someone in the community needed shelter, they found it. I joke that, I didn't know what a community garden was growing up, and I moved to the big city, and I found these little plots of community gardens out there, and then it hit me that my grandmother always had a community garden, because they had 100 acres of land there, and they grew everything, and they grew it to live off of. And you shared it with your neighbors. And so if your neighbors needed something out of that garden, they came and got it, and family came and got it. And so my grandmother just had this real belief system that we had something to give to somebody else. And it didn't matter how rich or poor we were, we had something to share with the greater good. And by the way, my family was, my grandmother had less than a sixth grade education. And quite frankly, both sets of my grandparents had less than a sixth grade education. But there was this belief that we had something to give back, and that we should go about doing that for the greater good.
And so what would your grandmother think about she's coming from a very religious place. What would she think, or what did she think about working for an organization that promotes LGBTQ equality?
Oh, that would be, I don't know if we have enough time for that.
Go for it.
Look, I think my grandmother was a very loving and supportive woman. And so because I was doing something that I loved, she would be supportive, and she would wish me nothing but the best. I actually think she would be conflicted with her faith and what I do. And I don't know if she would be 100% supportive of the Equality Act, if I'm being honest with you. But I do know that my grandmother is someone that I would have been able to continue to have conversations with and to educate her on this issue and many issues out there that her faith may have told her differently, and that she had enough education that she would have been able to form her own decision. But again, complicated because my grandmother was deeply rooted in her faith, and her faith misguided her in thinking that somehow that her gay grandson deserved less than she did. And that just didn't sit well with everything that my grandmother fought for. Her society told her that she deserved less than her white counterparts in the state of Mississippi, and yet she fought to be equal there. And so it would be complicated. Again, I think she would be loving and supportive of me as an individual and happy for me for the work that I do. But we would have many, many deep discussions around the Equality Act and why LGBTQ people needed these protections. I think she would have gotten there, but I'm not sure. We never got to have these conversations in depth.
A lot of the theme for today's discussion has been engaging people who might not agree with us and how to talk and how to engage. One of our supporters, actually our co-president Dan Barker, asked, "Well, why not just tell a legislator or someone who is deeply religious and very much believes that the Bible is the Word of God? Well, just tell them it's wrong to call homosexuality an abomination." And as he says, those ancient bigots who wrote the Bible did not govern our secular democracy. Could you just do that?
I think people have been doing that for centuries out there, and I don't think it's really gotten us any place. And I think, if we come from our extreme points to attack their extreme points, I don't think that we actually move anyone. I think you, again, have to meet people where they are. And then educate them and try to move them. I also believe that when you have someone who compares me as a Black gay man to a number of things that you would never compare a human to, those are unreasonable people. And I don't think you should spend much time in your personal capacity nor my professional capacity talking with unreasonable people.
Makes sense. And when you were growing up, did you hear the phrase North 1, South 0, halftime? And what does that phrase mean to you?
I heard that probably from the time I started to understand the English language to even when I go home today. There is on bumper stickers. It is all over the place. And what it meant to me was, in the South, we call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression there. I think what it means is that the Southerners there that are still holding on to this pre-Civil War era is saying that this fight is not over with and that they're waiting for an opportunity to rise up and fight again, the same fight that we fought many, many years ago. And so for me, it tells me, one, careful with that person. They're not a friend, they're not an ally. that person is a little bit dangerous for you. And I think as a greater sort of member of the country, it scares me because I think that it is the language and the belief system of the North 1, South 0 halftime that can be directly connected to the insurrection at the Capitol. And let me be clear, I'm going to call it a coup attempt because that's what I personally believe. Insurrection is a nice, language, a nice word in the English language that cleans it up a little bit and makes it a little bit less threatening, but it was a coup attempt for me.
What was interesting, too, about not just that coup attempt, but what we've been seeing at Ffrf, and one of the things I kind of think relates to this question is this pushback on, kind of just progressivism that's going on in this country. So we see it with, if you look at the flags, the shirts, the signs that people had at that insurrection, there were extremely racist signs, anti-Semitic, Christian nationalist. And so I feel like there must just be this, there's these segments of the population that feel like the country's no longer theirs because they're not, it's not adhering to these values that are really exclusive and kind of white Protestant in a way. And so I'm just kind of, you saying that, I think, kind of tied together to me a little bit. We see in our line of work fights over monuments, fights over flags, and you're seeing that right now too. I think with some of these monuments to some of the worst people in history in terms of how they treated Black Americans. There's fights going on today about people defending those, and so it does seem a little bit interconnected beyond just the most recent election that we all had. There's feelings that are tied to religion, to race, to democracy that were present at that one day that we're all kind of observing. So I just kind of felt the connection with what you were saying there.
Yeah, what I would say here is I think so many people want to make the June 6th coup attempt about what was going on in the country around this election. And I just think that is misguided, and I think that has led hundreds of years of white supremacy off the hook. Because this was not something that happened because the election happened in November and the people that showed up at the Capitol didn't like the results. This was the combination of people feeling like their country that had protected them, had built them up, that had told them that they were superior to Native Americans, to women, to Blacks, to gays, currently now to Hispanics and Latinos, that their country is telling them that they are not superior, that they're equal there. And that is deeply rooted in white supremacy. And since we are, asking atheists here, let's just break this down. Modern day religion, and let me back up, religion, not modern day religion, always has been deeply rooted in white supremacy from my personal standpoint. Religion was used to tell the slaves that slavery was okay. And that was done because they were trying to protect white supremacy. The ability of a white person to enslave someone else. Religion told people that they could hunt and kill Native Americans in this country. That was to preserve white supremacy. It was to empower white people, Europeans. And we see that all across the country where religion has been used to preserve or empower, to preserve white supremacy or empower white people. And that's where we got to on June 6th. And that was not a couple of months in the making. That is deeply rooted in the soul of our country and in our belief system as a country, and quite frankly, across the world. Religion, just one last point, religion actually told the Europeans to go settle, as using their language, to go settle Africa, a country that was rich in its own rights, a country that had many great systems in place. When Europeans showed up to bring religion to them and bring organized government to them, that was also white supremacy, and that was based in religion.
And as Congress looks at the January 6th attack, do you feel that there will be a tendency for Congress to not pay as much attention to the Christian nationalist, white supremacist forces that moved the January 6th coup attempt forward? Or do you think it'll be more about readiness, military preparedness, or who didn't call who?
I think you're already seeing that it's a little bit more of a shell game of who didn't call who and who wasn't prepared, and a little bit of a blame game going on here. I think you have certain members of Congress, House and Senate, that are trying to have revisionist history on what happened just a few weeks ago, and they're trying to tell a different narrative. That is on purpose. And so, yes, I firmly believe that, the white supremacy is going to get overlooked, and we're going to go and hopefully not build walls around the people's house, but build walls and have more military installations around the Capitol that says that our government isn't open to us when it's only a few of us that wants to overthrow the government.
And so what can we do as people who are activists, people who are concerned about these issues? What can we do in relationship to Congress and the White House to make sure that Congress keeps focusing on the June 6th coup had strong roots in white supremacy, had strong roots in Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think we have to call out members that are trying to tell revisionist history. And we have to tell the stories of what actually happened. I'm not generally a big fan. Like, I generally avoid TV on September the 11th. I don't like to relive trauma like that. But I do think that in this case, we have to continue to show who showed up at the Capitol, what they stood for, and what their intent was. I think that we firmly have to do that. And, I know that there's a lot of debate out there around, like, should you be turning your family members in, and should you be putting them up on calling them out on social and stuff like that. Well, if you've been talking to your family members and they haven't changed, and you think that they committed a crime, then I think as an American, you have a responsibility to report them to the authorities and make sure that they are being held accountable for the coup attempt that happened on January the 6th. And so I think that people need to call out the elected officials that are trying to tell revisionist history. I think people need to be turning in people that showed up at the Capitol on the 6th and caused damage and was there to therefore a coup, need to be turning those people over to authorities. And I think that people have to constantly tell people in their communities what January 6th was really about. It was not about sort of the non-certification of an election or Donald Trump or anybody else. It was really about preserving white supremacy.
Thank you, Ben. And if you have questions for Ben Needham from the Human Rights Campaign, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
I think we did have a question about, I guess more so some of your history originating in some labor organizing, and where I'm in our studio in Madison, Wisconsin, where AFSCME, I think, was originally founded in Wisconsin. And so I'm just kind of curious on kind of how that's impacted some of the work you're doing and the importance of labor organizing.
Yeah, I have very fond memories. I've been in the state of Wisconsin over the years working at AFSCME. And I'm a little bit biased, and so if I could say so myself, one of the best labor unions that we have in the country. Labor taught, I'm not going to say labor taught me, labor reinforced the views that had been instilled in me as a kid growing up in Mississippi, spending time at my grandmother and grandfather's farm, was that labor powered the middle class. Labor is the reason that minorities, women, people of color went from poverty and into the middle class. It is the reason that we have things in place today that protect us all. We all work for, organizations that would probably be categorized as progressive, but I benefit from the labor movement by having paid sick leave, by having vacation time, by making sure that I get time off to go vote, making sure that I have health care. And so labor did all of those things. And I think labor, in addition to helping workers speak with one voice, around workers' rights, they also created a sense of community. And I think labor at one point did a very good job of bridging the gap between blacks and whites, especially in inner cities, that were working on assembly lines together, that was working in organizations together, and may not have thought that they had things in common or that their needs were the same. I think labor helped bridge that gap, that divide for people. And so when I look at labor, I see an entity that is deeply rooted in making this place a little bit better than we found it. And part of that process is bringing us all together to do so.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other? Go ahead, Mark.
So one of the things that's just really interesting about Wisconsin itself is that it's home to some of the most conservative members of Congress. The Republican majority in the Wisconsin legislature is routinely returned to power, even if Republican legislators receive fewer votes in total than the Democrats. So what happened in Wisconsin? I mean, Wisconsin was home to Robert La Follette, the progressive Wisconsin governor and senator. It's also a large home of the American free thought movement. So what's changed in Wisconsin?
Yeah, it is real sad that such a strong labor state went through some of the things that they have gone through over the last 10 to 12 years. I do think that the state is a tide is turning and that we're headed back to a state that is going to return to its roots of being part of the labor movement and what the founder of asked me. But here's where I think what happened. In the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, there was a guy that came along by the name of Ronald Reagan, and he was a very good messenger. And he had a way of communicating, his views that are very different than my views in a way that most people thought, that makes sense. And I think one of the things that he did was attack labor. And he did it in a way that put white people within the labor movement against black people within the labor movement. And he put white people outside of the labor movement against those that were in the labor movement. And so Ronald Reagan figured out how to tap into, and again, these are my personal beliefs, tap into the racial divide of the country and figure out how you connect that to labor and so many other things in this country that we're still paying for because Reagan was such an effective communicator and was able to put that divide there. And I think that's where you start to see this notion that, well, you got this and you shouldn't have it versus, oh my God, labor have healthcare benefits. They have 3 weeks of paid vacation. They are making, $25, $30 an hour. How do I organize to get that? You had a Reagan with his way of communicating told you that you should go fight against that. Not that you should go fight for that, but go fight against that and keep somebody else from getting that. And he talked about this individual responsibility. And so we became a little bit more selfish because of Reagan messaging out there where we were all fighting for the things individually versus collectively fighting. And that's the heart of labor, is being able to collectively fight for the things that you want. And he was able to bring that divide there. And I think that you saw in the 80s, you saw white flight out into, especially in the South, and I can speak about this from the South, but, you saw white flight out into the counties, the suburbs and things like that. And you left the cities that became majority black. My hometown is a prime example of that. And at that same time, what you had was white labor union members moving out to the suburbs and black labor union members living in the city. And you had that racial divide, just that gap widening. And for some reason, we didn't see the damage that was doing within the labor movement and within our country and didn't react to it quick enough. And I think that is the reason why the opening happened in Wisconsin. Also, I just think that Wisconsin elected some bad people. And those bad people decided to do some very bad things to working class people.
Yeah, and one of those things, this isn't an FFRF issue, but I think it's a democracy issue, is, a lot of this kind of ties back into some similar themes. And so representation in government is a problem in the state of Wisconsin based on how things have been gerrymandered. And so I think that there's so many issues that, that we've talked about today that kind of are cross-pollinated on other things. So our state church issues in part are responsive to, are people represented in government? And does government care about them that they're not religious and maybe government shouldn't be doing things for them? So I think Wisconsin being an example of there can be funny things even though a majority of the people of the state might think a thing or be a certain way. That doesn't mean that's necessarily who's the governor or who's in our state House and our state Senate. So it's a very just being here for the last 18 years, I guess, it's been interesting to watch on those things. And we've been in a place too where there's been a heavy evangelical force in our state legislature pushing for policies that they want, even though they're not popular. School vouchers, for instance, most people don't support those, but our state legislature, most of them do. So this central themes of democracy, I think, have kind of permeated things that you've mentioned, and I can speak, specific to Wisconsin, but I think that's certainly a thing that's very present in 2021 to be thinking about, and how we select and who are our leaders, and we may see that in the Senate. We talked about the Equality Act. Most people in this country presumably actually support the policies behind it, but can you get the number of votes to actually, approve it? So I think that's going to be something to watch.
Representation matters, and I think the gerrymandering that we've seen across the country has really affected how we make policy. If you carve districts to elect a certain sliver of people from the American population, you get policy that those people want to enforce. And I think that is exactly what has happened. I think for me that is the amazing things that I've seen, this past cycle, especially coming out of a place like Georgia, where people are feeling empowered to re-engage with civic engagement. And that is a very positive thing. And again, I go back to the 80s where this is where we start to see the chipping away of fairly drawn districts that started to put us in our corners and really not creating a place for the middle for their views to come out. And so I think right now what you have is some extremely conservative districts and some extremely liberal districts and a handful of districts that represent the middle where we're fighting constantly for, who controls that seat. And I think that is city council level, state legislative level, as well as in the U.S. Congress and Senate.
Yeah, well, this has been great. You've shared a lot of insights for us. Mark, I don't think we've covered most of the topics we were looking to discuss today. So I thank you.
And more. So Ben, thank you so much for being a great guest, and this has been a wonderful journey. And thanks for bringing us with you about your upbringing and throughout your working career and your views on life. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that you all are doing around the Equality Act and for your members and for your supporters. And remember that we're always happy to have people engage with us around the Equality Act and our policies. And as Mark said, you can go to www.hrc.org, sign up to be a community co-sponsors, or you can go to ffrf.org and sign up for their systems. And they are great partners of ours as we try to move the Equality Act forward. So however you sign up, just sign up and get to work with us.
All right, thank you. Well, that concludes this week's episode of Ask an Atheist. Join us next week. We do this every Wednesday. And tune in to Free Thought Matters, which airs on Sundays. And check our website for stations.
And this week's guest on Free Thought Matters is Indian actor and activist Suhat Singh. He has been at the forefront of protests objecting to Prime Minister Modi's Hindu nationalist policies in India, and his activism has had a negative effect on his acting career. He was interviewed live from his car at the end of his workday in Mumbai, and he told us of the line of thinking that made him embrace atheism.
Every animal knows what to eat, what not to eat. how to procreate. Naturally, they all know. It seems only us humans, supposed to be the finest creation of God, we need to have a user manual to learn how to live. I mean, I'm sorry, that sounds wrong. Either God created us, the perfect being, God. He created such imperfect people who don't know how to live. Doesn't sound right.
And you can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the U.S. on Sunday mornings or on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. And check out Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show. This week's guest is author, non-generian, editor emeritus of the Charleston Gazette in West Virginia, the wise and revered Dem Hott, who's doing a weekly blog for FFRF on all things free thought. Learn how to listen to Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thank you so much for being with us today.